And welcome to the first of our panel discussions here, the effects of tech decoupling on the supply chain. The recent war in Ukraine is the latest driver in a fast-moving drive towards tech decoupling with countries such as China and Russia, being cut off from access to Western technology and materials. How do companies operating globally navigate these troubled waters, and where access to markets can be restricted by governments and very often at short notice? I'm joined today by four panelists. To my extreme left we have Keith Bryant from Keith Bryant Consultancy. To his right we have Tom Forsyth from Kaizen Corporation. And to my immediate left we have Dieter Weiss from Informa. So welcome, gentlemen. Thank you for joining me today. My first question is, early in the pandemic, it appeared that technologies were diverging between autocratic states microcontrolling their citizens' lives and those in the West who valued their freedoms and didn't want to share everything with the state. Is this really happening? Tom?
Well, the early days of the pandemic were tough, right? To deal with these issues. People were trying to figure out what was true, what were personal issues, and then what was demand going to be. There was a lot of reaction to some companies really throttled back on purchasing. That information flowed to their suppliers, who got scared and stopped their supply lines. As we all know, it's a lot easier to turn off supply lines than it is to turn on supply lines. Perhaps we knew this before, but we've certainly been retaught that lesson. That's what happened to a lot of the automotive guys. They were all buying all their chips from Taiwan. They canceled their orders. The guys in Taiwan said, okay. They came back 6 weeks later and said, oh, well, you gave up your spot in line. It'll be 6 months or 8 months or 18 months. So there were a lot of, it's kind of like the stock market, right? Like today, the U.S. stock market is in free fall. Yeah. And the people that lose are the ones that give up today. Because, so those reactions are what caused a lot of those troubles in the beginning. And now our supply chains are so integrated and so complicated. Well, there's been a deep hole to dig out of, I think.
Yeah, there's been an awful lot going on, and it's a combination of effects. But you mentioned there the supply of components to companies from Taiwan. I mean, there's definitely been some examples of companies, Chinese component suppliers, favoring their Chinese customers rather than letting these components come to their other customers in the West. Now, it's probably a case of the Chinese customers are larger users, they use the volume materials. But have you come across any examples of that, Keith?
Yes, several. I mean, one of the things that you're seeing, and it's human nature. You're going to take care of the people closest to you in terms of customers. And yeah, generally they're also the biggest customers. They're paying in the same currency. You don't have all the shipping times and all the hassles and everything else. It makes life so much easier. So yeah, when there is a constriction, it's the people that are a long way away that suffer. And it's really, regardless of the prices that they're paying, it's a lot easier to deal with the people that are that close to you than it's harder to deal with all the others in different time zones. And you're always, everybody became worried about things flying because nothing flew. Ground transport became a nightmare. Everything in the sea got stuck. And if you can just put it in a truck and send it to somebody, and a few hours later it's there, then life's easy. You're going to get paid. So you can't blame anybody for taking those options.
Yeah. Dieter, I think that's right. There's one of the big drivers as well, of course, has been the freight prices. The freight prices have gone through the roof. So it makes a lot of sense to have shorter supply chains.
When we look at the allocation problem in general, first of all, we have to see the last one, which was MLCCs, was totally different. The one on the semiconductors now, we have to realize that the value of the individual semiconductor is much higher. So the impact for the industry is or has been much severe. And when the automotive industry drove their build programs down, at the same time we had the lockdown situation, and we saw a rise in demand for communication equipment, for video conference and all of that, and those products in the majority are being manufactured in China. Yeah? So it is for sure that there was a drain from the Taiwanese foundries to China, and not necessarily to Europe. Yeah? And when the automotive industry finally decided, oh, we want to build some more cars again, the capacity was gone. Yeah? Tough luck. Yeah? And then they started complaining and blamed everybody. But in actual fact, it was themselves who was to blame.
Interestingly, Toyota, what I read, okay, perhaps not true, but what I read was that after Fukushima, Toyota did the same thing that all the car companies did this time, where they said, oh, we don't know what's going to happen, stop orders. And they got out of line and they got in trouble starting back up after Fukushima. So when it happened, and the same problems, the same terrible challenges. Yeah. So this time around, they were the only guy that didn't get out of line. Which is why they kept selling cars. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, they basically kept their supply chains open and did everything that they could to keep everything running. And
it made the same mistake before within recent memory.
Yeah, they learned from a very, as Tom says, they learned from a very bad mistake. But I mean, multinational companies currently are using their facilities in China to buy components and then shipping them internally. Yeah, and they're doing that just to get over the fact that, the Taiwanese and a lot of the Asian people are supplying to whoever's nearest. And
the stories of things getting stuck in containers and ports. Everybody at this show has one of those stories. Okay, so that's not an unreasonable preference to my mind, as unfortunate as it is.
So Tom, what are the dangers then of tech decoupling?
Well, I think there's a very clear lesson from these goings on, is that it's not a crazy idea that sole sourcing is bad, right? I mean, everybody, governments don't like it, companies don't like it, but fundamentally, we have largely gotten in that boat for many things, perhaps not intentionally, but yet we're in that boat. I think there's going to be a very clear, strong, strategic decision made in 1,000 companies to say, like Toyota did, okay, I did a logical thing, I got burned. Well, when the next time comes around, I'm not going to get burned this time. I think you're going to see vast chunks of the industry make small decisions to make sure they have supply in lots of places.
Right.
Which means that's opportunity for people to make things in different places that maybe 30 or 40 years ago was commonplace, but today is not. I think you're going to see that change start to grow in lots of different places, and some of them unexpected, whether that's in the States or in Western Europe, where you think, it's too expensive to do that. I think you're going to see some of that stuff grow there, because I don't think people are going to want to live through this again in 10 years.
No, I don't think so. And I think as if each supply chain shock comes in, it's going to drive people more towards doing these second and third sourcing and more regionalization.
And not 5%. I think you're going to see meaningful shifts of quantity to make sure that, because remember, every manufacturer needs somebody to base load their business, right? That's how the lights come on. So, you give me 5% of your business, well, I'm not going to be there for you when things get scary. You give me 30 or 40% of your business, well, now you're important to me.
Right.
I believe that we're going to see lots and lots of that in a million different ways across the industry. It'll take time for that all to happen, but I believe that is a path that is in front of us with little doubt. What do you think?
And on top of that, we see the infrastructure. which is getting more expensive. We saw container prices rising by 600% last year. All of that had an impact, but even worse is that the supply chains were interrupted. People in the logistical department, and I have to say my daughter is working in logistics for a big American company in Frankfurt, and she said we couldn't rely anymore on our Chinese suppliers because we didn't know when we would get the product. So they finally pulled out last year 2 products from China, and they brought them back. It's insourcing. It's not being manufactured by an EMS anymore. The companies manufacture it themselves in the factory. And at the end of the day, the engineers were smart enough to develop the processes in a way that they said it's the same cost as it had been when we sourced it in China.
Yeah.
So it is possible.
It is possible. But you know, the freight prices, that brings me on to my next question, which I'll start with Keith, and that is, you know, the current situation in Shanghai. I mean, is the Chinese policy for zero COVID, is that going to filter through into another supply chain shock for the electronics industry? Because the number of factories that are closed out there is ridiculous.
Yeah. And the factories are closed, and I don't know if you guys have seen it, but there was a lovely picture of the harbor, which is I think the second largest in China and about the 4th largest container port in the world. And there's something like 380 container ships just moored off it that can't come in, can't go anywhere. And obviously, if they're not unloading, they're not loading up to take what's there.
Right.
Apparently, they're having to buy extra space to put the containers that they can get in there to move them on. And then you've got, you know, poor guys in factories who are living in the factories now because they can't go home, they can't go anywhere because of the lockdown. And the only way they can keep production going is to basically live in the place that they're working, and then they can produce stuff, and then it's a nightmare then to get it out of the quarantine area, to get it to the port, to get it shipped. And
one of the unsung stories, Keith, and this has been happening throughout COVID in all parts of the world, in that, you know, they'd say, oh, well, your factory's making a strategic something, so you're open, it's no problem. But the lorry driver can't come get the product or bring you more raw materials.
Right.
So you're an island until you run out of raw materials because they can't, and they may be at the port, maybe they're near, but they can't get delivered because these rules are very complicated. I think all the governments of the world, in their own way, and you know, governments aren't great at stuff like this. I don't care where they are. They've said, okay, well, yeah, we want you're strategic, so you're open. Oh, you need the lorry drivers. Well, you know, a week or two later, go, okay, we'll figure something out about the lorry driver. Well, then we need some other piece of it. And what they're doing is they're making these thin little narrow supply chains that, back to your daughter's point, are by nature unreliable. And that we've gone from these hyper reliable, hyper predictable systems to something that's maybe the opposite.
Oh, completely the opposite.
And we've grown our companies over the last 30 years relying on those efficiencies, and now we're back to dealing old school with you know hand signals and waving, and it's been challenging for everybody involved, I think.
I think the argument for regionalization is now quite compelling. It's compelling from all of the geopolitical events and the supply chain issues, and also even sustainability. You know, reducing the carbon footprint. Why should we be sending things across the other side of the world? You know, the only problem is that we've got to make sure that every part of the supply chain is in each region. There's no point just making chip fabs. You've got to have PCB manufacturers. You've got to have OSATs. You've got to have everything else.
And that's why this is many years in the making.
Yeah. And you have to realize today the European PCB production is at such a low level. You couldn't even pull back half of the demand in Europe back from Far East to Europe because there's no capacity left.
The U.S. is the same. I'm not sure what the percentage is, but it's very significant.
Well, 85% of your boards are made in China.
Yeah.
I mean, literally.
Yeah.
Global production.
So we still have a lot of homework to do, definitely. And by just discussing at the moment what the European Union is doing, discussing that we need to have more foundries, more semiconductor manufacturing in Europe is not good enough. Yeah? We need to look at the full supply chain, and even if we cannot guarantee full self supply and full independency, but the amount of dependency needs to rise. We need to have more local manufacturing, not just on the PCBA, but as well on the PCB and on several other components which today, and I don't have the overview, but I think a lot of those very tiny chips like resistors and so on are in the majority manufactured in Far East at the moment.
It's a brave new world. I think lots of opportunity, lots of challenges to get there, long-term play, and of course we live in a world where policies are anything but long-term generally. So
well, generally, when governments make policies, the problem is they're sweeping. You know, they're huge. But one of the other issues against the regionalization argument at the moment is the labour problems. I mean, the labour problems are across the world, but are they still going to be the choke point going forward?
Yeah, I mean, labor is a big one, but I'm going to break the rules and ask Trevor a question.
Yeah.
Do you remember in the UK when we used to mine tin?
Yes.
Because it's fine talking about PCBAs and PCBs and everything else, but we need to be able to have control over the base materials, or we can't make anything.
That's true.
And we have to get back to that level if we're going to do it properly.
And in fact, it's not just the mining. One of the odd things about some of the rare earths, and there's been lots of press about how they're mostly sourced in certain parts of the world. But the U.S., in fact, has loads of rare earths, but we've chosen to not be the processor of those. So we dig them out of the ground and put them on a boat, presumably, that then goes off to somewhere where they get processed. Chances are worth more money at the end of that. And then they make their way back.
And you also chose to pull out of a country that is the second biggest copper mine in the world.
Is that right? So it's partially digging it out of the ground in some cases. It's partially the processing. And your point about the PWBs, the boards themselves, those are industries that in the U.S. and Western Europe, the regulators haven't liked those businesses. So they've been there are a few left, but the capacity is not there for the volume. That's for sure.
And not only that. If you look at the engineering people who used to work in the PWB business, most of them are retired now, so we see a brain drain as well.
Yep.
I'd say in 10, 15 years from now, if one day somebody came to the idea, let's start manufacturing PWBs again, you first have to ask, where do we take the experts from? Because they are all gone. Yeah. So that's another problem. But within Europe, we still see a huge difference in the employment levels. There are many companies in the east, for example, Czechia, Slovakia, Hungary, who have full employment. They have nearly less than 3% unemployed people, which is full employment, more or less. On the other hand, we have countries like Romania, Serbia, Portugal, Spain as well, where we have high unemployment rates and where it would be beneficial to set something up to help the people go to work. Right. And going further, probably not at the moment the best idea, Moldova, even though it's a small country, but they have a lot of labor potential, and Ukraine as well. Yeah? Remember how many people used to work in the electronics industry in Ukraine, from Ukraine in Eastern Germany, Eastern Europe, like for example in Hungary or in Slovakia, or I know the world's biggest EMS in the Czech Republic, he used to employ a lot of people from Ukraine.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's certainly reverberating around, and I mean, talking about Ukraine, of course, a lot of the raw materials that we use in semiconductor manufacturing come from Ukraine. But as we spoke about earlier, when Russia invaded Crimea back in 2014, the semiconductor industry at least had the foresight to start doing second and third sourcing at that point for the the high purity neon gas, for example.
Yes, I think, as far as I know, they put half a year's supply on storage to make sure that they were able to continue manufacturing.
Right.
But your point about that is that's not just true for certain things. Because supplies are short, people, whether they're buying them in China and shipping them internally or just anywhere, inventories, whereas a year or two ago, before COVID, inventories were low, just in time, just in the nick of time.
Yeah.
Inventories are very different from that today. People can buy it, they're buying it, they're getting it inside, so they can make that production schedule when they get everything together. So I think end user inventories, I think, are at high levels.
But it's also
in general.
causing problems as well, Tom. There's a lot of small manufacturers that are really hurting because they're stuck with inventory that they can't use,
Right.
And they can't dispose of easily. But anyway, let's move on to my next question. I want to get through a couple. There's many financial pundits out there that are predicting a global recession, with demand intent running at 272% higher than last year for new products introduction in electronics. Do you think the electronics industry is likely to ride out the storm better than most?
Well, over the last 20 or 30 years, the answer to that question has been yes. That during the Y2K and 9/11 phase, the software guys kind of took it on the chin, but the industry survived. During the meltdowns in 2008, where kind of in big financial challenges, the industry really rolled through without
Too much
disaster. So I think the odds are in our favor, but these are not fine-tuned instruments that the governments have to use to try to change the elements of our economies. So it's always hard to predict what sort of turns out on the other end, and throw a little trade war and tariffs and a war, a land war in Eastern Europe on there. I think it's very difficult to really call that very well moving forward. There's a lot of dynamics that are very non-traditional right now.
Keith, I mean, you've got a lot of customers. You work with a lot of customers that are bringing in new products and introducing them into manufacture. Are you seeing a big, insatiable demand there?
Yeah, I mean, if I was to sum it up, it's everybody's trying to make it business as usual. As I forget who it was, but one of these guys to my right said, we had COVID, and suddenly everybody wanted to buy electronics. And that's the nature of electronics. It's such a broad basket of things, and it sits in everywhere. We were selling more laptops because people were working at home. We were selling more screens because people were working from home. We were selling more internet connections because people were working from home. Unfortunately, we were also selling a lot more medical stuff because that was needed at the time. And we'll, as Tom says, we'll go through these cycles. But I think, if somebody, it would be as bad as trying to shut the taps off because COVID appeared. I think if people were trying to reduce new product introductions, they were trying to not put out upgrades and everything else, then first of all, it's a crazy thing to do because your competitors are going to carry on doing it. So I think the market wants it, people need it, and it's going to carry on going through. Okay. And yeah, if there's a recession, less people are going to be able to buy new stuff. People will upgrade. There's a lot of, I'm seeing in consumer electronics now quite a few clients who are refurbishing everything and reselling it because it's better for the environment, it's better for the world, and it's a lower cost to the end user. And who cares if somebody'd used your iPad before? It's completely wiped, it's cleaned, it's checked, and it's literally as good as new. So yeah, I think that we're going to carry on.
Okay. Well, here's a question for you, Dieter. Is the European ban on Russian coal and oil likely to impact the EMS companies in Europe?
Well, first of all, we have to realize, is this ban coming with immediate effect, or is this something that's going to happen over time? At the moment, we have a lot of countries complaining, like Hungary, like the Czech Republic, like Slovakia, who say it shouldn't start immediately. And with the German economy as well, coal is probably not a big problem. We can take that off fast enough. Oil is a little more a problem, but there are alternatives coming from the Arabian countries. I think gas is the biggest problem, because we still today need a lot of gas to generate power, current. And if that is cut off immediately, the government will have to make a decision whom to take off the line. You remember that, I think that was last year during the Olympic in China, when all of a sudden the Chinese government, with the argument that they wanted cleaner air, shut down their coal incineration plants, power plants, and then told different industries, you cannot manufacture today. That would be a similar situation over here in Europe, if the governments decide to cut off as of tomorrow.
I think that I'm going to phase it out towards the end of the year. That's my understanding.
Yeah, definitely we need to find alternatives, and we cannot find all these alternatives from one day to the other. And we are talking now about different ways, even in Germany, to get to gas again, and fracking is one of the words which has been very negatively discussed in the past, when a lot of fracking was done in the United States. But if the pain is high enough, you start rethinking. We are discussing all of a sudden now again as well to leave our atomic power plants running a little longer.
Right. Well, it's amazing how things have turned around so quickly from COP26 last year because of all the problems that we're suffering now. I'm going to move on to my last question, and that is simply, is digital transformation in manufacturing our best hope of putting in place systems to help us cope with these supply chain shocks in the future? In other words, if we've got digital control of a lot of this stuff, is it going to be easier? You know, the factories are more digitally agile?
Well, I think what we've learned over the last 20 years probably is that our digital data sets and our control technology has improved vastly. You know, when you look at the last few recessions around the world, they weren't a slope. They all were very sharp drops, and I think that was a tribute to the information technology. It's that demand was drying up, let's adjust. I believe those tools are going to be valuable as people try to negotiate this. But the challenge continues to be visibility.
Yeah.
You know, when you're in a smoke-filled room, it's pretty hard to see where you should hang the picture on the wall, and we're really in smoke-filled rooms right now. Yeah. I mean, that's the challenge. Our industry, as Keith said, has been very resilient. You know, thankfully. Okay, but yet the supply chains are still very opaque. You know, new innovations are delayed because, you know, some new EV guy comes out with a great product and goes to Taiwan and gets chips made. When's his place in line? Okay, it's not this year. So innovations will be compromised to some degree. You know, there's a major tumult that's still before us that I'm not even sure. Maybe it's peaking, but it certainly doesn't seem to be getting much better yet.
Well, just when one peaks, another one, or when one starts to subside, another one
shows itself.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Anyway, gentlemen, I think we're going to have to leave it there. It's one of these topics that is multifaceted, and we could talk about for hours, I'm sure. But I want to thank you all for coming in and stepping in so quickly. Keith Bryant from Keith Bryant Consultancy, Tom Forsyth from Kaizen Corporation, and Dieter Weiss from Informa for joining me today. And thank you for watching.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
At Kaizen, we know it's the science that makes the difference. The right solutions happen when you care enough to ask the right questions. And we understand that your performance is directly related to ours. Science knows why it works, care knows why it's important.
Electronics are part of our world, expanding by application to open up new opportunities for automotive, healthcare, and many other industries. But today's manufacturing techniques are not sustainable. They are energy hungry and inefficient, expensive and have limited flexibility. The world is asking us to do better. Introducing Pulse Forge tools, a new approach to thermal processes like soldering and curing. Design with more flexibility, manufacture with fewer process steps, reduce energy use, and decarbonize the supply chain. Expand your creativity to new levels. Designers are asking for more. They need to reduce form factors, reduce weight to work on wearables and stretchables, opening new market opportunities for consumers across the world, asking us to do better. If you think sustainability and freedom of design are not possible in electronics manufacturing, think again. Think Pulse Forge.